They mocked the new ER nurse. Then a Navy helicopter requested her by name. The radio crackled at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the voice that came through it was not the usual measured tone of a paramedic calling in vitals from a highway fender bender. It was sharp, clipped, military. Harborview ER, this is Navy Search and Rescue 77 Bravo, inbound with a Priority 1 trauma patient, ETA 11 minutes. We are requesting, by name, Nurse Chen. Repeat. We are requesting Nurse Maya Chen to be present at point of transfer. Please confirm. The dispatcher in the Harborview Regional Medical Center radio room blinked at the handset like it had grown a second mouth. She pressed the transmit button and asked them to repeat. The voice on the other end did not repeat slowly or patiently. It repeated with the kind of certainty that does not leave room for confusion. Nurse Maya Chen, she is on shift. We know she is on shift. Please confirm her presence at your rooftop landing pad in 10 minutes. The dispatcher swiveled in her chair and looked through the glass partition into the ER hallway, where, at that very moment, charge nurse Darlene Whitfield was standing at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee, telling two younger nurses about a mistake the new girl had made earlier that evening. They were laughing quietly. Not cruelly, exactly, but the way people laugh when someone with authority has framed laughter as the appropriate response. And 40 feet down that hallway, in Trauma Bay 2, a woman named Maya Chen was finishing a secondary assessment on a 62-year-old with a lacerated forearm, her gloved hands moving with the kind of practiced economy that most people in that ER had never noticed, or had chosen not to notice, or had decided didn't count. In about 9 minutes, everything in that building was going to change. Pause. Before we get to the helicopter, before we get to the admiral, before we get to the moment that left a 22-year veteran of that ER standing in a corridor with her career unraveling around her like a fraying thread, we have to go back to the beginning. Because the beginning of this story is not dramatic. It is quiet, and that is exactly why it hurts. Maya Chen arrived at Harborview Regional Medical Center on a Monday morning in early October, 11 months before the night of the helicopter. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was a habit built over years of a job where 7 minutes late could mean something unspeakable. She was 34 years old. She carried a canvas tote bag with a broken handle she hadn't gotten around to replacing. She was wearing clean scrubs, navy blue, a color she hadn't entirely shaken, and her dark hair was pulled back in the kind of bun that stays exactly where you put it all shift long, no matter what. She checked in with HR. She smiled at the woman behind the desk. She filled out the orientation paperwork with neat, precise handwriting. She listed her nursing credentials, her certifications, her years of experience. The HR coordinator, a pleasant young man named Derek, looked at the paperwork and said, "Oh wow, you've got a lot of certs. Trauma, critical care, flight nursing. Were you doing flight nursing somewhere?" Maya said something like that. Derek entered her information into the system and handed her a badge and told her to report to the ER charge nurse, a woman named Darlene Whitfield, who had been running this department for longer than most of the current staff had been nurses. If you asked anyone at Harborview about Darlene Whitfield, they would tell you she was competent. They would tell you she was organized. They would tell you she ran a tight unit. They would also tell you, if they trusted you enough, that she had a particular way of sizing people up in the first 30 seconds of meeting them, and that once she had decided what you were, there was very little you could do to change her mind. Pause. Darlene was at the nurse's station when Maya walked in and introduced herself. She looked at Maya the way a landlord looks at a rental application, quickly, efficiently, and with a conclusion already mostly formed. She took in Maya's age, her quiet manner, the way she stood with her hands loosely at her sides rather than arms crossed or hands on hips. She noted the lack of the usual new hire nervousness, which she interpreted not as composure but as naivety. She had seen too many young nurses come in thinking they already knew everything. "You're on intake observation for the first 2 weeks," Darlene said. "You shadow Patris, you ask before you act, and you don't touch a patient without clearing it with me or the attending. We do things in a specific order here, and I don't like surprises." "Understood," Maya said. "Your last position, it says clinic nursing on your application." Maya paused for exactly half a second. "I was working part-time at a Veterans Affairs clinic in Salem, yes." Darlene ends, nodded as though this confirmed something she already suspected. A VA clinic, part-time. She made a small sound with her mouth that was not quite a word and pointed Maya toward the locker room. It is worth pausing here to explain what Darlene didn't know. She didn't know that the VA clinic was not Maya's last real position. It was a transitional role she had taken during her terminal leave from the United States Navy. She didn't know that before the VA clinic, Maya Chen had spent 8 years as a Navy nurse, the last 4 of which were classified. She didn't know that Maya had 3 combat deployments to her name, including one to an active theater of operations, where she had served as the lead trauma specialist on a Tier 1 forward surgical team designated Ghost Actual, a unit that operated in austere conditions, far from established surgical suites, stabilizing patients whose injuries most civilian ER nurses would see perhaps once in an entire career. She didn't know that Maya held more advanced trauma certifications than anyone else in that building, including the attending physicians. And she didn't know that Maya had been personally commended for her service by a flag officer of the United States Navy, which is a formal recognition that most military careers never achieve. Maya had not listed these things on her application, not because she was hiding them, but because most of them required security clearances to discuss, and because she had learned over a long career of doing extraordinary things in invisible places that the work itself was what mattered, not the acknowledgement of it. Pause. If you're new to the Hearthside Narratives, welcome. This is the kind of story we tell here, real feeling, emotionally honest, deeply human stories about what happens when extraordinary people are placed in ordinary circumstances and treated as less than they are. We have a community of people who find these stories as compelling as we do, and if you've been watching for a while, you already know the moment is coming, the moment when everything shifts. We're not there yet. Stick with us. And if you feel moved to subscribe before we get to the good part, we would be honored to have you along for every story we tell. The first 2 weeks were a slow, grinding exercise in restraint for Maya. Not because the work was difficult, it wasn't, relative to what she had done, but because she was required to watch things unfold at half her natural speed, under the supervision of a nurse named Patris who was warm and well-meaning, but who moved through a shift like someone reading a map in a language they'd mostly learned. Maya asked questions when appropriate. She offered observations carefully. She did not volunteer her own instincts unless asked. She was, in all visible ways, exactly what Darlene had decided she was. A quiet, somewhat unremarkable new hire who had probably coasted through nursing school and done a few years in a low-acuity clinic setting. There were moments when the restraint cost her something. One afternoon in the 3rd week, she watched a patient in the waiting room, a man in his late 50s with a gray pallor and a very specific stillness in his jaw. And she felt the quiet, certain recognition that comes from having seen a particular kind of distress dozens of times before. She walked to the triage desk and said quietly, "The man in the blue jacket near the window, I'd like to move him to priority." The triage nurse, a young woman named Kelsey, looked over at the man. "He checked in for reflux. He's stable." "I know what he checked in for," Maya said carefully. "I'd just like him moved to priority." Kelsey looked uncertain. She called Darlene over. Darlene came, looked at the man, looked at Maya, and said, "He's waiting his turn. Don't create patient flow problems based on gut feelings. That's not how triage works." 20 minutes later, the man in the blue jacket went into a cardiac event in the waiting room and had to be rushed in under emergency protocol. They caught it in time. He was stabilized. He was fine. But when Darlene did the after-action review of the incident, she wrote in her notes that the patient had presented with atypical symptoms that were not apparent at triage, which was true, but which also was a way of accounting for the near miss without crediting the person who had flagged it. Maya said nothing. She read the notes. She let it go. Pause. Dr. Preston Vance was the attending physician who set the tone on most of Maya's early shifts. He was the kind of doctor who had been told he was excellent for so long that he had stopped feeling the need to verify it through other people's observations. He was technically proficient. He was also the kind of doctor who spoke about nurses as a category rather than as individuals, who said things like, "Get me a nurse," rather than using anyone's name, and who had a finely calibrated sense of whose competence he was willing to register. He had registered Darlene's competence years ago. He had registered the competence of 2 or 3 senior nurses whose confidence matched his own particular frequency. Everyone else was background. The first time Maya offered a clinical observation to Dr. Vance directly, a suggestion about medication interaction in a patient presenting with altered mental status. He looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the chart, and then looked at Darlene and said, "Is she cross-trained in pharmacy?" No, then let's keep our lanes clear. Darlene made the same sound with her mouth that was not quite a word. That evening in the break room, Maya overheard Darlene telling two other nurses, "She's one of those, comes in with a VA background and thinks every patient is a war movie. Seen it before. They burn out fast." There was laughter, warm, uncomplicated laughter. Maya poured her coffee. She did not turn around. She took her mug and went back to the floor. Pause. The breadcrumbs, though. If anyone had been paying attention, the breadcrumbs were there. There was the way Maya taped IV lines. It was specific and unusual, a particular pattern that was not in any civilian nursing manual, but that prevented line displacement in conditions of rapid patient movement, the kind used in aeromedical evacuation. One of the younger nurses noticed it and asked where she'd learned it. Maya said, "From someone who was very good at their job." The younger nurse thought it was a strange answer and moved on. There was the way Maya responded to noise. The ER was a loud place, but Maya seemed to operate on a different frequency, not rattled by sudden alarms, not frozen by unexpected complications, but recalibrating almost immediately, the way a compass needle returns north. Kelsey, the triage nurse, mentioned it once. "You're really calm under pressure." Maya said, "I've had good teachers." Another strange, sideways answer that nobody followed up on. And there was the scar on Maya's left forearm, not large, but positioned in a way that was medically specific, the kind of scar left by a field dressing applied under non-optimal conditions. Nobody asked about it. People rarely ask about scars in an ER. Everyone has a story and most people know better than to open it. Pause. Before we get to the first real crisis, we want to ask you something. If you're watching this video and you've known someone like Maya, someone who was underestimated, dismissed, or reduced to a stereotype by people who couldn't be bothered to look closer, please leave a comment below and tell us about them. We don't need their name. Just tell us they existed. Because this story is built on the truth that those people are everywhere, doing extraordinary things in rooms where nobody is watching. Your comment takes 2 seconds, and it means more than you might think. We'll see you in the replies. Pause. 7 weeks into Maya's tenure at Harborview, on a Thursday afternoon in late November, 2 things happened at approximately the same moment. A school bus traveling on the Old Coast Road lost traction on a wet curve and went into a shallow drainage ditch, and a pressure vessel at a small industrial facility 4 miles east of town developed a catastrophic failure. Neither event was life-threatening in the way a war zone is life-threatening. But together, in a 30-minute window, they generated more simultaneous trauma presentations than Harborview's ER had handled in a single event in over a decade. The radio alerts began coming in at 2:18 in the afternoon. Dr. Vance was the senior attending. Darlene was the charge nurse. The ER had a mass casualty protocol, a laminated document in a red binder behind the nurse's station that had been updated 4 years ago and tested via paper drill twice since. Darlene pulled the binder. She assigned stations. She called in 2 off-duty nurses. She was moving with the experienced efficiency of someone who had been in charge a long time, and it was real competence, genuine, practiced emergency coordination. Nobody is saying otherwise. But there were 15 incoming patients, arriving in staggered waves, with injury profiles that ranged from minor to severe. And the ER had 4 beds with full monitoring capability, 2 attending physicians, and a surgical team that was 15 minutes from being reachable. The first wave arrived. 6 patients from the bus, mostly soft tissue injuries, 2 with possible fractures, 1 with a head injury requiring rapid assessment. The second wave was still 8 minutes out. Maya was assigned to a monitoring station in the East Wing, intake vitals, documentation. A role Darlene had chosen specifically because it kept her away from primary patient contact. The head injury from the bus was a 17-year-old girl, a passenger, and her presentation was escalating. Her GCS, Glasgow Coma Scale, had dropped 2 points during transport. Dr. Vance was managing 2 other NTS simultaneously. The nurse assigned to her, a capable woman named Trish, was doing exactly what the protocol required. But the protocol required escalation to the attending for any GCS drop, and the attending was occupied, and the window in these situations is not forgiving. Maya was at the monitoring station. She watched. She waited the appropriate number of seconds for the chain of escalation to fire. It didn't fire not because anyone was neglecting their duty, but because the chain of escalation had 3 links and all 3 links were currently under active load. She walked to the girl's bay. She did not push anyone aside. She did not announce herself loudly. She simply arrived at the bedside and began a rapid neurological assessment with her hands and eyes, and the calm, systematic logic of someone who had done this in places where the only lighting was a headlamp and the only backup was silence. Trish looked at her. Maya, you're not. Her pupils are unequal, Maya said. Left is sluggish. Call a neuro alert right now. She needs imaging immediately, and we need to elevate the head of this bed 30 degrees. Do it now, please. Pause. Trish hesitated for exactly 1 second. 1 second. Then something in Maya's voice, not loud, not aggressive, not panic, just absolutely bone-deep certain, made the decision for her. She called the neuro alert. She elevated the bed. Dr. Vance arrived 30 seconds later, already irritated at the interruption of his protocol flow. He looked at the patient. He looked at Maya. He looked at Trish. Who called this? I did, Maya said. You're on monitoring station, he said. You're not assigned to. Her left pupil is sluggish and she's lost 2 GCS points since triage, Maya said. If we wait for the standard escalation pathway, we're going to miss the window. She needs a CT of the head. Now. Dr. Vance looked at the patient's eyes. He looked at the chart. And then he looked at the patient's eyes again, and something shifted in his face. The very specific shift that happens when a doctor who is about to be dismissive runs directly into clinical evidence he cannot dismiss. He ordered the CT. He called the neurologist on call. He did not say anything to Maya. The CT showed a small but evolving epidural hematoma. The neurosurgery team was activated. The girl was transferred to the OR within 41 minutes of her arrival. She was out of surgery 4 hours later, neurologically intact, with a prognosis her surgeon described as remarkably positive given the timeline of intervention. Pause. But here is where the story takes the turn that makes it necessary for us to tell it. The second wave of patients arrived, 8 casualties from the industrial incident, a chaotic, resource-intensive hour of triage, stabilization, and handoff that consumed every available person in the department. Maya worked through it without complaint, without drama, triaging, stabilizing, documenting, assisting. She caught a medication dosing error that had been entered in the rush, flagged it quietly, corrected it, moved on. She recognized a patient with signs of inhalation injury that the initial triage had classified as anxiety, escalated it appropriately, and was correct. She did these things without making them a performance. By 5 p.m., the second wave was stable. The department was exhaling. And then Darlene Whitfield walked into the break room where Maya was standing at the sink, washing her hands, and said the words that would define the next 4 months of Maya's life at Harborview. You abandoned your assigned station, Darlene said. Maya turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She turned around. I made a clinical judgment call to address an escalating patient presentation when the primary escalation pathway was not available, Maya said. You left your station without authorization to perform an assessment that was above your assigned scope for the current shift, Darlene said. I'm filing a conduct report. Pause. A conduct report. In the world of nursing, a formal conduct report is not a casual thing. It goes into a personnel file. It can affect future assignments, advancement, and in cases where it becomes a pattern, licensure. Darlene knew this. She was not doing it carelessly. She was doing it with purpose. Maya said, I understand. I'd like to document my clinical rationale for the record. You're welcome to do that, Darlene said. Won't change the filing. Dr. Vance, when HR asked him informally about the incident the next morning, said that Maya had exceeded her assigned scope and created confusion in a high-stress mass casualty situation, and that while the patient outcome was positive, the process was irregular. He did not lie about the outcome. He simply surrounded the truth with a frame that made it look like a problem. Maya read his statement. She wrote her own in the same neat handwriting she used for everything. She described her assessment. She cited the clinical indicators. She noted the timeline and the gap in the escalation chain. She submitted it to HR and to the director of nursing and went back to work. Pause. If you feel your blood pressure rising right now, you're exactly where this story needs you to be. The injustice here isn't loud. It isn't a villain twirling a mustache. It's the quiet, grinding machinery of a workplace where the rules are applied selectively, where competence without social permission is treated as a liability, and where a person can do something genuinely excellent and be punished for it because it didn't fit the frame of who they were supposed to be. We've all seen this. Some of us have lived it. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell us. Have you ever done the right thing at the wrong time in the eyes of someone who had the power to write it up? We read everyone. And if this story is landing for you, please like the video. It helps us keep telling these stories for the people who need to hear them. Pause. The conduct report was not the end of it. Over the next 2 weeks, Darlene made small adjustments to Maya's assignments, the kind that were technically within her authority as charge nurse, but that had the cumulative effect of reducing Maya's patient contact, increasing her administrative load, and positioning her, day by day, a little further from the kind of work she was actually trained to do. She was assigned early morning inventory. She was given the most documentation-heavy shifts. She was left off the rotation for the hospital's trauma team training day, with a note that cited her recent conduct filing as a reason for her to complete additional orientation review instead. Maya completed the orientation review. It covered material she had known for a decade. She completed it without comment. One evening, a per diem nurse who had worked with Darlene for years said to Maya quietly in the hallway near the locker room, "She doesn't do this to everyone, just the ones she can't figure out. You should know that." The per diem nurse's name was Rosaria. She was 60 years old and had seen a lot of charge nurses come and go, and her voice when she said it had the texture of someone handing you a map they wished they'd had earlier. Maya thanked her. That was the kind of moment she held on to. Pause. It was 4 months after Maya's arrival that the night shift on the 14th of February brought a particular combination of events that would, ultimately, end the story as everyone had known it. The shift started normally. Dr. Vance was the attending, Darlene was the charge nurse. Maya was assigned to routine triage documentation, a desk shift, essentially. It had become her default assignment. She had stopped pushing back on it. She had started to wonder quietly whether she had made a mistake by coming here. She had made a life in Port Colton. Her mother was 20 minutes away. She had found a hiking trail she liked along the headland. She had a plant on her windowsill at home that was doing unexpectedly well. She didn't want to leave. But there is a particular exhaustion that comes from spending 8 hours a day performing competence for an audience that has decided not to see it, and Maya had felt it settling into her shoulders over recent weeks like a physical weight. She was at the triage desk at 11:31 p.m. when the radio room dispatcher appeared in the ER corridor with an expression that made 3 different nurses turn their heads. "Somebody want to tell me who Maya Chen is?" the dispatcher said. Pause. Everyone within earshot stopped. Darlene set down her coffee. Dr. Vance looked up from a chart. Maya turned from the triage desk. "I'm Maya Chen," Maya said. The dispatcher looked at her. Then she looked at the room. Then she held up the radio handset. She had carried it physically out of the radio room, which nobody did ever, and she said, "There's a Navy search and rescue helicopter inbound 9 minutes out. They have a Priority 1 trauma patient, and they are asking for you by name." The room did not react immediately. There was a beat, a single held beat, in which nobody seemed to know what expression to wear. Darlene said, "That's not how medical handoffs work. They coordinate with the attending and the charge nurse." The dispatcher said, "Ma'am, I know how handoffs work. They asked for her by name, twice. The aircraft commander asked to confirm she was on shift before they locked in this facility." Pause. Dr. Vance stood up from his chair at the workstation. "What kind of patient?" "They didn't specify the injury in full," the dispatcher said. "They said Priority 1 blunt force hemodynamically unstable, but they asked for her." She nodded toward Maya. Darlene said again, with the authority of 22 years of charge nursing, "I'll be present at the transfer. Maya can assist." And then Maya did something she had not done in 4 months at Harborview Regional Medical Center. She did not wait for permission. She did not soften her voice or adjust her posture or frame her words to minimize friction. She said, calmly and completely clearly, "I'll be on the rooftop pad. Please prep Trauma Bay 1. I'll need blood type confirmation on arrival, 2 large-bore IV access kits, a thoracic assessment tray, and someone to call the surgical team now, not on arrival." She picked up her badge and walked toward the stairwell door. The room was very quiet for a moment after she left. Pause. We need to talk about what was happening in the air above Highway 101 at that moment, because it matters enormously to everything that comes next. A black government SUV had been traveling southbound on the coastal highway when a logging truck drifted across the center line on a rain-slicked curve at approximately 11:12 p.m. The collision was significant. The SUV was driven off the road and struck a concrete barrier. The vehicle's driver had non-critical injuries. But the rear passenger, a man traveling without public fanfare in civilian clothes, accompanied only by a single aide, had sustained serious blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen. The man in the rear seat was Rear Admiral James Hargrove, United States Navy, retired. He was the current director of the Pacific Naval Medical Readiness Command, not a ceremonial post, but an active command with operational oversight. He had been traveling to a private consultation meeting in Astoria and had specifically, by his own preference, traveled without full security detail, without public notice, and without the kind of arrangements that would make his presence on a rural Oregon highway an event rather than a drive. When the Navy search and rescue helicopter from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, already airborne on a separate coastal patrol, was redirected to the scene via emergency protocol, the senior medical officer aboard took one look at the patient's vitals, assessed his injury profile, and made a decision that would have seemed inexplicable to anyone at Harbor View Regional Medical Center. He asked his crew chief to radio ahead to the receiving facility and request a specific nurse. Pause. Because the senior medical officer aboard that helicopter, Lieutenant Commander David Park, Navy flight surgeon, knew exactly who Maya Chen was. He had worked alongside her. He had, in fact, owed her his ability to walk without a cane after an incident in a forward operating area 3 years earlier that neither of them would be discussing in any public forum. He knew her training. He knew her certifications. He knew what she could do with a hemodynamically unstable chest trauma and a limited equipment set and 8 minutes of prep time. And when he looked at his patient's vitals, he made the call that any rational person in possession of that information would make. He asked for Maya. Pause. When the helicopter set down on the Harborview rooftop at 11:52 p.m., Maya was already there. She had the tray she asked for. She had confirmed the blood type with the dispatcher's relay. She was wearing a trauma gown and she was completely, absolutely still, not the stillness of someone who is scared, but the stillness of someone who is ready. The rooftop door banged open behind her, and Darlene came through it with Dr. Vance 2 steps behind. And neither of them said anything because the helicopter was landing, and the rotor wash made conversation impossible. The transfer team came off the aircraft with the patient. Lieutenant Commander Park was the first one down the ramp. He looked across the rooftop, past Darlene, past Dr. Vance, and found Maya, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just identified where to set it down. He walked directly to her. He grabbed her forearm in a brief military grip, the kind between people who have been through something together, and said, loudly enough to be heard over the dying rotor noise, "He's in sinus tach, pressure's marginal, I'm worried about a splenic. He knows you. He asked for you when I told him where we were going." "How long was he hypotensive?" Maya asked. 12 minutes total. We got fluids in him at 8. Type and cross done. En route, Oneg on board. She turned to the gurney. Admiral Hargrove was conscious, which is its own remarkable thing given the circumstances. He was pale and his breathing was effortful, and his uniform jacket had been cut away and replaced with an emergency thermal blanket, but his eyes were open and tracking, and when they found Maya's face, something in them settled. "Commander Chen," he said. His voice was rough but deliberate. "Admiral," she said in a voice that carried complete normalcy, "we're going to take good care of you. Can you tell me where the pain is highest?" "Left side," he said, radiating up. "I know," she said. "Let's go." Pause. That is. When the room changed. Not the rooftop, they were still on the rooftop. But something in the quality of the air changed, in the way it changes when a story that has been going one direction makes a sharp and irreversible turn. Dr. Vance was standing 6 feet away, and he had just heard a critically injured patient, an injured patient who had been flown in by a military helicopter that had requested a specific nurse by name, addressed that nurse as Commander. And that nurse had responded with the easy, unframed familiarity of someone who has worked with this man before. Not as a civilian, not as a clinic nurse, as something else entirely. Darlene was looking at Maya. Her coffee was back downstairs, forgotten. She was looking at Maya the way you look at an object you thought you understood when it turns out to be something completely different from what you assumed. Maya was already moving with the gurney. Pause. Trauma Bay 1. The next 22 minutes were the kind of clinical work that does not announce itself with speeches or dramatic gestures. It is methodical, rapid, and utterly focused. Maya ran the assessment. She called orders. She coordinated with the flight surgeon and with the surgical team, who arrived in 10 minutes. She identified the degree of splenic involvement through clinical assessment before imaging confirmed it. She managed the hemodynamic instability with the precision of someone who has stabilized this injury profile in conditions that made a well-equipped ER feel like luxury. Dr. Vance was in the bay. He was assisting. And for the first time since Maya had arrived at Harborview, the role of assistant in Trauma Bay 1 belonged to him, not her. He did not resist it. He could not resist it because what he was watching was technically beyond his capacity to second-guess, and the part of him that was a genuinely trained physician recognized this even if the rest of him was not yet prepared to say it out loud. The surgical team took the Admiral at 12:31 a.m. The handoff was clean. The surgical team lead, Dr. Anita Correa, a direct, no-nonsense surgeon who did not deal in social dynamics, looked at Maya's pre-surgical documentation and said, in front of everyone, "This is the best pre-surgical trauma assessment I've received at this facility in 5 years. Who did this?" Maya raised her hand slightly. Dr. Correa looked at her for a moment. Then she took the patient through the surgical doors. Pause. The aftermath of those 22 minutes settled over Trauma Bay 1 like a silence after a piece of music ends. The equipment was still warm. The floor had been cleared. Lieutenant Commander Park was at the nurse's station filling out transfer paperwork, and he was the kind of person who fills out paperwork with total focus, which meant that the conversation he was about to have with the people standing around him was going to wait until he was finished, which was its own kind of deliberate. Darlene found Maya in the hallway outside the bay. The coffee cup was still nowhere in evidence. She said, "Can I ask what your relationship is with that patient?" "He's a former commanding officer's superior," Maya said, which was technically accurate and also, in the way of all technically accurate statements, incomplete. "You called him Admiral." "That's his rank," Maya said. "You're a civilian nurse," Darlene said. Maya met her eyes. "I was not always." Pause. Lieutenant Commander Park finished his paperwork at 1:14 a.m. He found Darlene and Dr. Vance in the nurse's station, which was quiet now that the immediate crisis had passed. He sat down across from them, and he folded his hands on the desk, and he looked like someone about to explain something that should not need explaining. "I want to tell you about the person who just ran your Trauma Bay," he said. "We know our staff," Darlene said. "With respect," Park said, "I don't think you do." Pause. This is the part of the story we want to sit with for a moment, because it is the part that matters most. Before Lieutenant Commander Park says what he is about to say, before the room understands who has been standing among them for the last 4 months, we want to acknowledge something. The people we dismiss are not blank spaces. They are full of history we haven't bothered to ask about. They are carrying credentials we haven't looked for, skills we haven't tested, and experiences we cannot imagine, and we process them through whatever filter we arrived with instead of seeing them as they are. This story is fictional, but the dynamic it describes is as real as the walls of any workplace you have ever been in. If this story is making you think about someone you know, or about how you yourself have been seen or not seen, please share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. The share button is right there, and it costs you nothing, and it might mean everything to the right person. Pause. Park spoke for approximately 10 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform indignation. He simply laid out in the measured, factual cadence of a military briefing who Maya Chen was. He described her 8 years of Navy nursing. He described her assignment to Ghost Actual, not in classified detail, but in the broad strokes that were permissible in a civilian context. He described 3 combat deployments. He described an operational tempo that most civilian emergency departments would find genuinely difficult to comprehend. He described her certifications, not the ones on her nursing license, but the additional ones, tactical combat casualty care at the instructor level, advanced trauma life support, ATLS, with a military modification designation, emergency medical technician, paramedic, ground, and aeromedical, a formal designation as a registered nurse first assist, meaning she was credentialed to perform surgical assistance under a licensed surgeon in austere settings, a designation that fewer than 2% of nurses in the country hold. He described, briefly, an incident during her second deployment in which she had managed a mass casualty event involving 11 patients with one other nurse and a physician assistant, in a location that had no power and no running water, for 6 hours before additional support arrived. 11 patients, 6 hours, one other clinician. He described her commendation, the formal Navy Commendation Medal, signed by Rear Admiral James Hargrove's predecessor, for exceptional performance under adverse conditions and profound dedication to patient care above and beyond the reasonable expectation of duty. Dr. Vance had not moved in several minutes. He was sitting very still. Pause. Darlene said eventually. She didn't put any of this on her application. Most of her assignments are classified, Park said. She listed what she could, the certifications that exist in the civilian system, the VA clinic. She didn't say. She doesn't generally, Park said. That was also something she was known for, she doesn't say. There was a long silence. She caught something in a mass casualty event here, Park said. A few months ago, bus accident and an industrial incident. I heard about it. She identified an epidural bleed and she was written up for it. The silence that followed this statement had a different texture than the ones before it. Pause. At 3:17 a.m., Hospital Administrator Patricia Ng arrived at Harborview. She had been called at home by the nursing supervisor on duty, who had made the correct judgment that the evening's events had crossed a threshold that required administrative awareness. Patricia Ng was 58 years old and had spent 30 years in hospital administration, and she walked into the building with the specific energy of a person who has been asleep and is now awake and doing the math on a situation, and finding that the numbers are not adding up in a flattering way. She was briefed by the nursing supervisor. She read the conduct report against Maya. She read Maya's formal response. She read the documentation of the mass casualty event and cross-referenced the timeline. She looked at Maya's personnel file, which contained, in the certifications section, a number of credentials that she now understood significantly differently than she had at any prior glance. She found Dr. Vance in the break room. He was staring at a cold cup of coffee. "Did you know?" she said without preamble. "No," he said. "Did you ask?" He did not answer that one. Pause. Patricia Ng found Darlene in the corridor near the nurse's station. Darlene's posture was the posture of someone who has been braced for an impact and is no longer certain from which direction it's coming. "I need to review your staffing assignments for this employee over the past 3 months, Patricia said. "I assign staff based on unit need and performance indicators," Darlene said. "I need to see the documentation supporting those assignment decisions," Patricia said. "All of it, by end of business today." She turned to go, then turned back. "Darlene, how many times did she submit clinical observations that were overridden or not actioned?" Darlene said, "It's an ER. We get new hires who overreach all the time." "That's not what I asked," Patricia said. Pause. At 6:45 a.m., Rear Admiral James Hargrove was out of surgery and in the ICU. His prognosis was good. The surgical team reported that the intervention timeline had been precise and that the pre-surgical stabilization had been, in Dr. Correa's words, optimally managed. At 7:03 a.m., he was conscious enough to make a request. He asked to speak with the nurse who had received him in the trauma bay. He gave her name to the ICU charge nurse. He said clearly that he wanted to thank her before he slept. Maya was still in the building. She had been asked to remain for a debrief, which she had agreed to. She had been awake for 19 hours when the ICU charge nurse found her in the corridor near the stairwell and gave her the message. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then she straightened and said, "Of course. Give me 2 minutes." Pause. She found him in Bay 4 of the ICU, propped slightly upright, monitors tracking steadily, the gray morning light coming through the window at a low angle. He looked like what he was, a 61-year-old man who had been through a serious trauma, and was processing it with the controlled awareness of someone whose entire career had involved not panicking in difficult circumstances. When Maya came in, he looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Commander Chen." "Just Maya these days, sir," she said. "Sit down," he said. She said. I told Park you were the best trauma clinician I had ever personally witnessed in a non-surgical role, he said. I told him that 3 years ago. I told him that because it was true. Maya didn't say anything. I heard you've had a difficult few months here, he said. It's a good hospital, she said. New environments take time. He looked at her for a moment. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The commendation doesn't go away, he said. What you did over there, none of it goes away. I want you to know that it is seen. Whatever has happened here, whatever anyone here has decided about you based on whatever information they had, it is seen. Pause. If you have ever been in a position where you needed to hear those words, that what you do is seen, that it matters, that the invisible work counts, then you understand why that moment in that ICU room lands the way it does. Rear Admiral Hargrove said 6 sentences to Maya Chen, and they carried the weight of every shift she had quietly completed, every observation she had made without credit, every morning she had come back to a job that was actively trying to diminish her. Please subscribe to the Hearthside Narratives, because this is what we do. We find these moments, and we hold them up so that people can see them. New stories every week, and not one of them will waste your time. Pause. At 9 a.m. that morning, Patricia NG convened an emergency meeting in the main conference room of Harborview Regional Medical Center. Present were Darlene Whitfield, Dr. Preston Vance, the Director of Nursing, the hospital's HR Director, and the Chief Medical Officer. Maya Chen was not initially asked to attend. She was standing in the hallway outside the room waiting because she had been told to make herself available. Patricia NG opened the meeting by distributing printed copies of 3 documents. The first was Maya's original nursing credentials as entered in the hospital system. The second was a supplemental document that Lieutenant Commander Park had provided in writing at Patricia's request, a summary of Maya's military service record, appropriately redacted, that had been cleared for release at the patient's request. The third was a timeline that Patricia's team had assembled overnight, cross-referencing every clinical observation Maya had made in 4 months with the subsequent patient outcomes. I want to walk through this timeline, Patricia said. The meeting took 2 hours and 11 minutes. We are not going to recount it blow by blow because the details are dense and procedural and the emotional truth of it can be stated more simply. Everything that had been framed as a problem, every overreach, every unauthorized action, every conduct note looked entirely different when viewed through the lens of who Maya actually was and what she actually knew. The mass casualty interventions, the cardiac patient in the waiting room, the medication dosing catch, every instance of competence that had been penalized or erased or reframed as a liability was, upon examination, a moment of exceptional professional care. And every note, every assignment adjustment, every informal comment Darlene had made, documented in the HR system, in assignment logs, in the break room comment recalled by 2 nurses who had been present, became, upon examination, a pattern. Pause. Darlene Whitfield said at one point in the meeting, I did not know what she was. Patricia NG said, with respect, Darlene, that is exactly the problem. You did not know what she was because you did not ask, and you were not interested in finding out. You had already decided, and that decision shaped everything that happened in this department for 4 months. Dr. Vance said, I want to put on record that I supported the clinical outcomes in every case. You wrote a statement, Patricia said, holding up a page, characterizing a correct and potentially life-saving intervention as irregular process. That statement is in a conduct file that currently exists in this employee's record. I'd like to know if you'd like to revise it. There was a silence. Yes, Dr. Vance said, I would. PAU. SE. The formal outcomes of that meeting were documented and processed through appropriate HR and administrative channels over the following days. Conduct matters of this nature involve institutional processes, union protocols, and careful procedural attention to all parties' rights, and Patricia NG was scrupulous about all of it. We are not going to compress that process into a cartoonish 5-minute takedown, because real accountability is not cartoonish, and the people who work through it deserve to see it represented honestly. What we will tell you is this. The conduct report against Maya was formally withdrawn, reviewed, and removed from her personnel file with a documented notation that it had been filed in error. The supplemental assessment documentation was added to her record. Her assignment structure was immediately and permanently revised to reflect her actual qualifications. She was offered, with the full support of the chief medical officer, a formal role on the hospital's trauma team, a role that would eventually become a named position, trauma nursing specialist, that Harborview created specifically because they had not had a credential category for what she was. Darlene Whitfield did not lose her job. This is important to say clearly, because real accountability is not always termination, and the story is not made lesser by that fact. She received a formal written reprimand, which went into her own file. She was required to complete leadership and bias awareness training. She was removed from direct supervision of Maya's assignments. She was placed on a performance improvement plan with a clear set of expectations, monitored over 6 months. She was also, and this is the part that is harder to assign a procedure to, confronted, in a one-on-one meeting with Patricia Ng, with the full picture of what had happened under her watch, including the mass casualty event, including the cardiac patient in the waiting room, including the overnight on-call data that showed Maya had made more clinically significant contributions than any other nurse on rotation during her time at the hospital. Darlene sat through that meeting. She did not make excuses by the end of it. That is not a small thing. It is worth noting. Pause. Dr. Vance revised his statement. He also, and this came later quietly without announcement, knocked on the door of the break room one afternoon when Maya was on a lunch break and said, "Can I speak with you for a minute?" Maya looked up from her soup. He sat down across from her. He was not comfortable. You could see it in the way he was sitting, which was not his usual way of sitting. He said, "I was wrong, not only about the conduct incident, about a lot of things. I watched how you work and I decided what it meant before I understood what I was watching. I'd like to say that out loud because you deserve to hear it out loud." Maya looked at him for a long moment. He had the decency not to fill the silence. She said, "I appreciate that, Dr. Vance. I mean it." "Preston," he said. "Preston," she said. That was the whole conversation. Sometimes the whole conversation fits in a small room over a cooling bowl of soup, and it is enough. Pause. And now we need to pay off the title because a story called, "They Mocked the New ER Nurse." Then a Navy helicopter requested her by name. Owes you the moment it promised. 3 weeks after the night of the helicopter, Rear Admiral Hargrove was discharged from Harborview Regional Medical Center in good health, with a recovery prognosis that his surgical team considered exceptional. He walked out under his own power, which was the outcome he had been working toward from the moment he was conscious enough to want things. He had requested, through the hospital administration, that a brief formal acknowledgement be arranged before his departure. Patricia Ng had agreed. And so, on a Tuesday morning in early March, with the Oregon coast doing its usual pale, beautiful thing outside the windows, a small gathering assembled in the main corridor of Harborview's ER. It was not a ceremony in any military sense. There was no podium, no microphone, no bunting. It was a hospital corridor with fluorescent lighting and a wipe-clean floor and the ambient sound of a working emergency department. The staff who were on shift and several who had come in on their day off, including Rosaria, the per diem nurse who had given Maya a map once in a dark hallway, were standing in a loose arc near the nurse's station. Maya was at the station because she had been told to be there but not told why, and she had guessed from the gathering that something was happening but had not guessed exactly what. Pause. Admiral Hargrove walked into the corridor in civilian clothes, and he walked directly to Maya, and he held out his hand. She shook it. He did not let go right away. He said, in a voice that carried easily across the corridor without being raised, "I want to say something on behalf of the United States Navy, and on behalf of myself personally to Lieutenant Commander Maya Chen, United States Navy, retired." The room was very quiet. This woman served her country with distinction in conditions that most of us cannot imagine. She brought the same standard of care and the same dedication to this civilian emergency department that she brought to every theater of operation in which she served. And the standard that she brought here, in this building, in this department, on ordinary shifts, and in extraordinary circumstances, reflects everything that the uniform she used to wear stands for. He paused. "I have been in the military for 37 years. I have seen a lot of medical professionals under pressure. She is among the finest I have encountered. And I am personally grateful that on the night of February 14th, she was in this building and that she was ready." He looked at her. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "You were ready." Maya looked back at him. Her hands were still. Her face was composed, but her eyes were bright, and anyone watching would have known exactly why. Pause. The room moved after that, the way rooms do after something true has been said. A rustling, an exhale, someone starting to clap and others joining. And then a full, warm, uncomplicated sound of acknowledgement that filled the corridor like something that had been waiting to arrive for a long time. Rosaria was clapping the loudest. Kelsey, the triage nurse, was crying a little, which she would have been embarrassed about if half the other nurses hadn't been doing the same. Dr. Correa, who had come down from surgical specifically for this, nodded at Maya once with the look of a peer recognizing a peer. Darlene Whitfield was standing at the edge of the gathering. She was clapping too. It was a complicated gesture, clapping for someone you wronged in a corridor where you wronged them in front of the people who watched it happen. But she was doing it. And Maya looked at her briefly, without hostility, without triumph, without theater, just looked, and then looked away. Pause. We need to sit here for a moment at the end of this story and say what it means, because the meaning is not in the helicopter or the admiral or the formal acknowledgement, as satisfying as all of those things are. The meaning is in the 4 months before, the 7 minutes of early arrival that nobody noticed, the careful handwriting in the clinical notes that nobody praised, the cardiac patient in the waiting room, flagged and overridden, who went home safe anyway, the mass casualty shift where she caught things others missed and was written up for it, the orientation review completed in silence on material she had known for a decade, the coffee not turned toward when laughter was happening at her expense. The meaning is that excellence does not always announce itself. Dignity does not always demand recognition, and the people who are most quietly extraordinary are often the ones most quickly decided upon by the people around them. Maya Chen could have told them. She chose not to because she had come to believe, after years of doing the work that mattered most in places where no one was watching, that the work itself was the point. The doing of it, the showing up for it, the being ready every shift, on every floor, in every corridor, against every piece of paperwork that tried to reduce her to a category. She was ready, she was always ready. And eventually, inevitably, the world she was in caught up to what she already was. Pause. That is the story, and we mean it when we say thank you for spending this time with us. If you made it here all the way to this moment in the corridor, all the way to Maya's eyes going bright and Rosaria's applause and the pale Oregon light outside the window, then you know this is the kind of story that we need more of. Not because the world is full of injustice, though it is, but because the world is also full of Maya Chens, people who show up, people who stay ready. People who do not perform their excellence for rooms that don't deserve it, and who simply, quietly wait for the world to catch up. We tell these stories because those people deserve to be seen. Please subscribe to the Hearthside Narratives so you never miss one. Every story we tell is for the people who need to hear it, and for the people who are living it right now and haven't been found yet. Pause. One more thing before we close. Maya Chen in this fictional story asked for nothing that wasn't already hers. She didn't lobby for the new title. She didn't petition for the conduct report to be pulled. She didn't campaign for the acknowledgement in the hallway. She showed up. She did the work. She was ready. And the helicopter came. There is a version of this story where it ends differently, where no helicopter comes, where no admiral arrives, where the conduct report sits in the file and Darlene's frame holds and 4 months becomes a year, and the person who could have been the finest trauma specialist that ER had ever seen quietly resigns and goes somewhere else, and Port Colton never knows what it had. That version happens, more often than this one, and it is the reason this community exists, to say, loudly and often, that the version where the helicopter comes is the version we should be engineering every day, in our workplaces, in our teams, in the way we receive new people and decide what they are. You do not have to wait for a helicopter to tell you that the person standing in front of you is worth seeing clearly. Look closer, ask the question, let the answer surprise you. Pause. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone or of yourself, or of a moment in a corridor where someone was seen or not seen, we want to hear from you. The comment section belongs to you, and it is one of the most extraordinary things about doing this work. The conversations that happen there between people who have never met about the moments that mattered. Drop your thought below. It doesn't have to be long, it just has to be real. And watch the next one. We've got more stories coming that have the same bones as this one: quiet people, fierce competence, and the beautiful, inevitable moment when the world catches up. We'll be here. And so will Maya Chen every single shift, 7 minutes early, ready for whatever comes through the door. This is the Hearthside Narratives. Thank you for being here.